Welcome to Pearl Harbor. Before you, the stoic white monument to USS Arizona, where on December 7th of 1941 she would lose 1,177 crew members and plunge the United States deep into the dark days of World War II. And yet, just 1,000 yards forward of her, the graceful bow of USS Missouri would rise proudly above her, her guns elevated in salute, a tribute to those 1,177 sailors. On the decks of this mighty warship, the Japanese would surrender to the Allied powers on Sunday, September 2nd of 1945. 3 years, 8 months, and 26 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, World War II would come to a close as this mighty warship lay at anchor in Tokyo Bay. Join me today as we go aboard this mighty warship and learn her history, her wartime service, and most importantly, what made the Mighty Mo so mighty.
Aloha and welcome aboard. The battleship Missouri is no small feat of engineering. Completed in 3 years and 23 days, she measures in at 887 feet long, 108 feet wide, and tips the scales at 58,000 tons, fully loaded. Construction on Missouri began on January 6, 1941, at the New York Navy Yard in Brooklyn, New York, and was finished on January 29, 1944. Upon completion, battleship Missouri would serve 3 wars for the United States Navy: World War II, the Korean War, and the Persian Gulf War in 1991. She was as powerful and feared in 1991 as she was in the Pacific theater of World War II in 1945, a testament to her crew and these magnificent guns that made her so mighty. In World War II, the Missouri would fight through 3 major battles: the Battle for Iwo Jima, the Battle for Okinawa, and the shore bombardments of Hokkaido and Honshu. She provided naval gunfire support and bombarded the manufacturing hubs of the Japanese war machine. In Korea, the USS Missouri would see 2 tours of duty and would earn 5 battle stars for her service in 5 major battles of the war. Her 16-inch guns would be fired over 3,000 times. She covered the evacuation of the Chosin Reservoir and marine landings at Hungnam and Samcheok. Following her heroic service in the Korean War, Mighty Mo would be decommissioned in May of 1955. While decommissioned, the USS Missouri would lay idle for 29 years. But by the request of President Ronald Reagan in 1984, all 4 of the Iowa-class battleships, Iowa, New Jersey, Wisconsin, and Missouri, would be returned to service, refitted with new weapons, including Tomahawk cruise missiles, Harpoon anti-ship missiles, and close-in weapon systems, or CIWS. In the reactivation of 16-inch guns, USS Missouri would hold the distinct honor of being the first surface ship to launch a Tomahawk cruise missile from the Persian Gulf in 1991. During this war, her 16-inch guns would fire 783 times. Following her dedicated and heroic service in the Gulf War, USS Missouri would be the last battleship in the world to be decommissioned on March 31st, 1992, at Long Beach Naval Shipyard. By late 1944 and into 1945, the Japanese were well aware that the tide of war had turned against them. Yet the Japanese continued to fight on and launched an extremely feared weapon against the Allies. They used a weapon known as the Divine Wind, or kamikaze. On April 11th of 1945, off the coast of Okinawa, USS Missouri came under attack by numerous waves of kamikaze attack planes. The crew shot down without question 11 of them, but 1 Japanese Zero fighter managed to break through the storm of anti-aircraft fire and strike the side of the USS Missouri's hull. As you can see, minimal damage was done to Missouri, but the plane was sheared in half, pieces of it strewn across the deck. The remains of the Japanese pilot were discovered smashed into a forward bulkhead. On the morning of April 12, 1945, the 19-year-old Japanese pilot would be laid to rest by an enemy crew in hostile waters, one of the few recorded instances where full military funeral honors were given to an enemy during combat. We've spent some time talking about USS Missouri's wartime service, her large array of weaponry, and her service spanning 40 years. Our conversation today has largely been about USS Missouri's ability to bring weaponry to bear on her enemies. But the lasting legacy of Missouri is not one of warfighting or destroying her enemies. Instead, the lasting legacy of USS Missouri is one of peace, as the symbol of peace and the symbol of the end of war. September 2nd, 1945. In the early morning hours, 3,000 sailors anxiously rise from their racks and begin their morning routine. But this day is different, for these men know that they are about to witness history. They are about to witness the end of a war. At 8:30 that morning, an American destroyer, the USS Buchanan, would bring aboard Admiral Chester W. Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur to USS Missouri for the official ceremony to end World War II, as Missouri lay at anchor in Tokyo Bay, Japan. They are led to Admiral William Halsey's stateroom, where they would await the arrival of the Japanese delegation. At 8:55, the 11 men of the Japanese delegation are brought aboard, and slowly they make their way to the starboard 01 officer's veranda deck, site of the surrender ceremony. Awaiting them are scores of Allied officials brought aboard earlier to represent their respective countries in the end-of-war proceedings. At 9:02, MacArthur, Nimitz, and Halsey would make their way down the ladders and to the site of surrender. The ceremony begins with a short prayer, and MacArthur would follow with the official opening statement. We are gathered here, representatives of the major warring powers, to conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored. The issues involving divergent ideals and ideologies have been determined on the battlefields of the world, and hence are not for our discussion or debate. It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past. MacArthur then motions for the Japanese delegation to come forward and sign the instruments of surrender. First is Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu on behalf of the Japanese civil government. With Shigemitsu's signature, the civil authority of Japan has surrendered for the first time in 2,000 years. Following Shigemitsu, General Yoshijiro Umezu, the Chief of Staff of the Imperial Army, steps forward and signs. With his signature, the Japanese military is surrendered for the first time in 2,000 years. To accept the Japanese surrender on behalf of all Allied powers is General Douglas MacArthur. He signs with 6 pens. Joining him that morning are 2 prisoner-of-war generals, Jonathan Wainwright of the United States and Arthur Percival of England. These men were POWs for 3 years in Manchuria. Upon their release from prison camps, they stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, and their combined weight was 197 pounds. Each would receive a pen as a token of appreciation and remembrance from Douglas MacArthur. Following MacArthur, the rest of the Allies came forward and signed on behalf of their respective countries. To close the ceremony, MacArthur intones these words: "Let us pray that peace be now restored to the world, and that God will preserve it always." These proceedings are closed. Thus, World War II ended, and for some countries like Japan, the fighting has finally stopped after 10 years of war. For the United States, war ended after 3 years, 8 months, and 26 days. The Missouri stands today as a constant reminder of the price of war and the exultation of victory, not just for America, but for the entire world.